All right, once again, thank you all for attending WEAT and TACWA's 85th Legislative Session Review webinar, What's New and How It Will Impact You. I have Heather Cook here, who will be co-presenting with myself, Julie Nargon, and Heather Cook is she manages the government relations for Austin Water and is the Vice President of WEAT. She chairs WEAT's Government Affairs Committee and is the Legislative Chair for TAWWA. She also serves on the board of TWCA. Heather formerly managed Travis County's legislative program and served as a paralegal with the Philadelphia Water Department. She holds a master's degree from the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And as said before, my name is Julie Nargon. I'm the current Executive Director of WEAT and TACWA. I hold a Bachelor's of Science in Economics and Sociology from Trinity University in San Antonio, as well as a lifetime student membership to the London School of Economics. We're both pleased to be here and looking forward to going over a few bills with you today. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please submit them using the question dialog box shown at by the thumbnail image on your screen right now. You can just go ahead and type in your questions and submit them throughout the webinar. We will address all questions during the Q&A session after the presentation. And after the webinar, if you would like to review the complete webinar, go to the URL shown at the bottom of your screen, www.weet.org/2017 legwebinar.shtml. You can view both the webinar and the presentation slides. And with that, I'd like to go into a few of the metrics. Now, the 85th legislative session saw the second highest bill filing numbers in all of the sessions. We saw about 6,800 bills and joint resolutions filed, and this is second to the 81st session in 2009, where over 7,000 bills were filed. So this begs the question, what's going on? Why so many bills? And can we infer any overarching trends from this? And the answer is, well, maybe. Texans are enjoying economic growth that's outpacing the national average, even with a downturn in oil and gas. And because of this, or along with our relative economic growth, Texas's population is also increasing. So Texas boasts the second biggest economy in the U.S., behind only California. And Forbes lists Texas as the #1 state in economic climate. So being the second most populous state and also the 5th fastest growing state, what does this mean? Well, simply put, economic and population growth create more issues that our lawmakers are dealing with and show up as bills filed. So our two chairmen that saw most of the water bills we'll be discussing today are Charles Perry, Chair of the Senate Ag, Water, Rural Affairs Committee, and Lyle Larson, Chair of the House Natural Resources Committee. Both are well-versed on water issues, and Senator Perry has really come into his own on water issues in the state. Both are well-traveled, and Larson in particular is creative in his thoughts of how to move water around the state and how to guarantee adequate supply for all Texans. Now, jumping into our bills this session, we tracked a number of bills that passed and were not vetoed and were signed into law. So the first bill on the list is H. Bill 101, sponsored by Craddock. And this provides for provisions for the design and construction of at least a 10 MGD reclaimed facility in Midland. This is an interesting bill. It's heavily bracketed and only applies to Midland with regard to the financing and construction of a wastewater treatment plant and a future source of water for Pioneer. So essentially, this is a concern of Pioneer's that if they go ahead and help finance this wastewater treatment plant, they want kind of a guaranteed access to water. With turnover in city council, they thought that they wanted to codify this in statute to guarantee that future water source.
Okay, this is Heather Cook, and I'm delighted to be here with all of you, joining Julie on this webcast. So I'm going to talk now about House Bill 257. These are still slides we're talking about bills that passed that were not vetoed. And this bill by Representative Hernandez that passed requires the Texas Workforce Commission to develop, in consultation with the Texas Coordinating Council for Veteran Services, they have to develop a report on transferable skills to assist military veterans and active service employees who are trying to transition into civilian employment, to try to identify the 5 most common military occupational specialties that these service members are coming out with, and then align those with industry-based certifications. So I don't know if water and wastewater certifications will make this list, but hopefully this will help shed more light on veterans that are coming out with skills that could be used in our industry. And this report has to be done no later than September 1, 2018 by the Texas Workforce Commission.
Thanks, Heather. Next bill that indeed did pass was House Bill 1290 from Roberts, and this was loosely modeled after one of Trump's issues that he said he would like to see, and Trump's was a 1-for-2 bill, but Roberts is essentially a 1-for-1 bill, which means that before a new rule is adopted by a state agency, one rule must be repealed. So on the 138th day of the 140-day legislature, this bill actually had some exclusions carved out of it for both the TCEQ, PUC, and some other state agencies as well. So up until 2 days before the session ended, this would have included rules adopted by the TCEQ. But again, because of the Senate Conference Committee sections exempting TCEQ and PUC, as well as health and safety and water resources, explicitly stated, this will not impact the TCEQ.
I just want to add, though, as a footnote, so that repealer provision does not impact TCEQ or PUC, but there is a second portion of the bill, and by my read of it, that would broadly impact all rulemaking going forward, requiring all agencies that adopt rules in the future to include a government growth impact statement, and specifically that statement needs to include an analysis of whether the proposed rule is creating or eliminating a government program, whether this new rule would create any new employee positions in the agency or eliminate any employee positions. Look also at whether the rule would increase or decrease, would require more legislative appropriations in the future or less, and some other, whether there might be fee increases as a result of the new rule. That's a key one, because we do see fee increases from TCEQ. We're going to talk about that a little later, and some other specific items that need to be included. So that actually the comptroller is going to have to adopt rules, ironically, about this rule bill by October 2017. And that's another provision in this bill that says, of course, if the legislature requires a rule be adopted, then the agency does not have to repeal another rule if the legislature is dictating. So at any rate, stand by for rules from the Comptroller's Office for those of you who follow rulemaking at TCEQ and the PUC.
Thanks, Heather. And
there was one other bill on that slide. We're just going to back up for just a moment. And that would be a bill by Representative Navarez, House Bill 2369. And it was on the prior slide that you should see in a moment. And that was a bill that did pass also, that requires or that authorizes school districts to challenge water and wastewater fees inside cities. And this bill, as originally filed, would have allowed these school districts to challenge both rates and fees. And for those of you that are on the line that operate utilities inside cities, right now, any customers inside a city do not have authority to challenge their retail rates at the PUC. So this was sort of the beginning of a possible challenge to that current provision, and what ended up passing, Texas Municipal League got engaged in this bill, and they narrowed the bill down significantly from allowing appeals of rates and fees to simply fees that are based on the number of students or school employees. And again, that's House Bill 2369. So we believe that this is just going to only impact possibly one or two utilities that Representative Narvaez had particularly focused on in his district. So let me know if you have any questions about that one. Let's move on. Bill's not vetoed. So then we have House Bill 2729, which should be up on your screen here, by Representative Lucio. And this is another one similar to that military transition bill we just talked about a moment ago. But this one is focused on trying to encourage high school students to get certificates for employment once they get out of high school, which is really, I think, a phenomenal idea. High school and be employable, and ideally come work in our wastewater or water industries with a TCQ certificate, perhaps. So this is again directing the Texas Workforce Commission to develop the statewide inventory of all these certificates that can be achieved, earned in high school. And part of this inventory, it's got to be posted online. They're going to do this in conjunction with Texas Higher Education Board, and the inventory has to include the fees that students would have to pay to earn these certificates, as well as the average wage or salary for jobs that people could get coming out with the certificate. And it also has to be updated every year, and this inventory has to be provided to every school district and public institution of higher education. So this is an awesome opportunity for WEAT, TACWA, and AntiBiosolids and others to really expose more, put more focus on the certificate programs and the great jobs that people can get through being certified as wastewater and water operators.
Absolutely, Heather. You know, WEAT and TACWA have always been strong supporters of anything that would allow for easier access to certification, thereby bringing in a well-trained workforce to help staff our treatment facilities. And so we applaud Lucio III for pushing forward with this bill. And the next bill showing on your screen is House Bill 2771 by Phelan, and that's relating to the wastewater treatment permit application. So essentially, this is a TCEQ cleanup bill, and it removes a $10 fee for each on-site wastewater treatment application process. And a little bit of background on this bill. The $10 fee was enacted in a previous legislative session and was to be collected by a now sunsetted agency. And that agency was to use that fund of collected $10 fees to provide grants for different studies for on-site septic systems, et cetera. And when that agency was sunsetted, the collection of the fee then rolled into the TCEQ. But since the TCEQ has been collecting it, no grants have been made. And so this bill just cleans up what a previous session enacted that is now redundant.
And then we have House Bill 3177, also by Representative Lucio III. And this was actually a bill that was initiated by TWCA, and a broad bill relating to matters at the TCEQ, in which, and this is really for the administrative lawyers who are listening, but they were getting excited about this bill, including our attorneys at City of Austin. Excited to see this bill pass. But basically, it allows, if there is a decision made by the TCEQ director, which would be Richard Pye, the executive director, that somebody wishes to challenge they can make an appeal to file a motion to overturn with the TCQ commissioners, the 3 members that are appointed by the governor that oversee TCQ. So they can file a motion to overturn the executive director's decision without having to simultaneously file an appeal at district court. So this really eliminated a duplicative process. And so now there still is an ability to go ahead and appeal a district court if TCQ commissioners don't rule the way an appellant wishes. It simply takes away that duplicative step. So this is definitely an example of reducing some redundancy in government and improving operations. So we applaud that bill by Representative Bill.
And the next bill showing on your screen is HB 3618. And this bill was very important to both WEAT and TACWA members as it sought to repeal the synced TPDES permit expirations within the same watershed or river segment. Previously, all permits were on a 5-year river basin permitting cycle, which actually created a lot of inefficiency and unnecessary work by our utilities and the TCEQ. If any amendment or any change to your permit was necessary, you would have to submit that and still be in line with the 5-year expiration, which actually meant that many utilities saw short-term permits as little or as few as 2 years. So this really removes kind of the unnecessary syncing of that 5-year permit water basin cycle.
And just to be clear, my understanding of this bill, the permits are still going to have to be renewed every 5 years, but it just means that they're not all going to be expiring at the same time. So I know for Austin Water, we're delighted to be able to spread this workload out so that we're not a big long list of permits to follow. So didn't want anybody to think the 5-year expiration deadline, permits are still going to have to be renewed every 5 years.
Thanks, Heather. And a little bit more background on this. One of the initial reasons that this was actually passed in a previous legislative session, or rather the 5-year permitting cycle was passed, was to allow for studies of river basins and to make any determination on any negative impacts that discharges were having to any aquatic life. Well, that's now being done through Clean Rivers program and a number of other programs that post-date the 5-year permit basin cycle law. So really this repeals an unnecessary piece of legislation that was causing quite a bit of financial and labor burden on both our utilities and the TCEQ.
And I believe TCEQ actually initiated this legislation, so kudos to them for seeking this out and trying to streamline their processes and getting this. So moving on, this is another bill, actually SB 1105 by Senator Hinojosa. This is another bill that TCEQ also initiated. They did a study of all of their water fees. It was actually directed by the budget bill last session that TCEQ look at all their water fees. And I know I've heard Richard Hyde and Stephanie Bergeron and others from TCEQ talk about this study and how much work they put into this. And this is a really helpful tool to have this study of all the fees. And as those of you that pay these fees are probably well aware, TCEQ's water programs are heavily reliant on fees that they charge to, among others, the water and wastewater utilities. And and of course they get federal funding as well, but they increasingly are getting less and less general revenue for water programs. So fees are a big deal. The fees did go up. TCEQ was facing a shortfall, as they have been in the past, and they had to increase some of these fees on our water and wastewater plants last interim. But the good news here, SB 1105 by Senator Hinojosa takes an account called the used oil recycling account that receives funding from a 1 cent existing fee on any quarter motor oil that's used for changing oil in cars. So this is already an existing fee that's been in place for a long time. There's no fee increase on consumers, but this fee was dedicated to this used oil recycling account, and it really wasn't being fully utilized. So TCQ, again, took the initiative to ask the legislature to be able to basically merge that used oil account where this penny fee was going into their water resources management account, which is their big major water account where they fund all their major water and wastewater programs. So there was an $18 million surplus sitting in this account unused, and they estimate about $2 million coming in per year in future revenue streams from this ongoing fee. Again, they're not increasing fees, they're just better utilizing this existing money, and hopefully that will mean that it will reduce the need for them to have to raise fees on our water and wastewater plants for the foreseeable future, at least in the near term. And then we also have one more bill that passed that was not vetoed, Senate Bill 1289 by Senator Creighton. This modifies the existing U.S. iron and steel requirements for Water Development Board's projects. For those of you that are seeking SWIFT funding or considering seeking SWIFT funding, this bill, in certain of its earlier iterations during the session, would have extended U.S. iron and steel requirements on SWIFT projects right now, and as the bill passed, the U.S. iron and steel requirements are not imposed on SWIFT projects until, and this is a key deadline, May of 2019, so that if you get an application in for SWIFT, and they'll be taking more applications probably early next year, or if you already have an approved project, SWIFT project, where Water Development Board has issued a resolution approving your project, as long as that resolution of commitment from Water Development Board is issued by May 1, 2019, according to this legislation, your projects are not subject to U.S. iron and steel requirements. However, after May 2019, this U.S. iron and steel will be imposed on SWIFT projects as well. They do make some exceptions for availability of the U.S. iron and steel, or if it would increase project costs more than 20%. The bill also requires that any projects that are currently subject to iron and steel, which is basically all the other Water Development Board funding projects essentially, for the most part, such as the clean water and drinking water SRF projects, that there's going to have to be a report done by the state auditor on U.S. iron and steel costs for those projects. So Water Development Board will be working with the state auditor on that report. Great, thank you, Heather. And next on the screen, just wanted to provide a little bit of levity in this presentation. If you guys weren't aware, the 140-day session saw quite a bit of acrimony. And some harsh words were thrown back and forth across the aisle, but there were also some real head scratchers and some pretty funny bills. So I'm just gonna show a few of those right now. Hope you guys have a laugh wherever you are in your office. These bills did not pass, to be clear. And feral hogs have made quite the appearance in the last 3 to 4 legislative sessions. Indeed.
All right. Now moving on to a number of bills that were passed, but were struck down by Governor Abbott's pen. So the first of which is 2377, HB 2377 by Larson, who saw a lot of his legislation be knocked out by Governor Abbott after the 140-day session. Yes, so this bill was one that built on the bill that Larson passed last session that designated brackish groundwater production zones, and this bill was going to direct groundwater districts to develop rules for that production of brackish groundwater that would have allowed for more efficient use of that groundwater potentially, and to help give guidance to these groundwater districts, because essentially there are, this is all new territory and there's a lot of excitement going forward about the possibilities of using brackish groundwater. Of course, it's expensive to do the desalination involved, but it's still a very
very potentially profitable and rich resource of water in the future. So the governor, whenever he vetoes a bill, and he did veto 50 bills, he has a message for why he vetoed each bill. That's a requirement. And on this one, he said that essentially he felt that while brackish groundwater is an important source for the future, he felt that these particular rules, I think he felt this legislation was a little bit too detailed, and he thought that it needed to be addressed in a different manner than this bill was approaching it on. So that was his justification for vetoing this bill. And there is a special session coming up. We will talk about that more at the end of the webcast, but my sense is any bill that's been vetoed probably will not come back during this special session. So we'll probably have to wait another 2 years to see this one again.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, just to extend a little bit on what Heather said, as she mentioned, this actually takes a bill from the 84th session, HB 30, I believe, and extends on it. And that previous bill was basically the science behind groundwater and brackish groundwater production. And so it kind of looked at the zones and really studied where it was in the state. And then this bill would have provided for the permitting of brackish. As Heather said, Governor Abbott did veto 50 bills, but I believe that number is actually closer to 42, as a number of those 50 bills were duplicate House and Senate identical bills, and so I think it was about 42 distinct bills were vetoed. And the next bill that we're covering with you guys that we tracked that was also vetoed is shown on your screen as HB 2798, and that's by Farrar in the Houston area. And that would have allowed for a reuse water pilot program for subsurface irrigation and toilet and urinal use of wastewater treated at a Harris County facility. Farrar sponsored 2 bills that were very similar. This was one of them that did pass, and essentially it would have allowed for the reuse of any form of wastewater treated on site. So that wastewater would have to be treated at a county-owned facility and could be used for irrigation or toilet or urinal flushing, as said before. This was a pretty creative and interesting bill, and it's one that WEAT and TACWA did support, as we'd like to see more reuse pilot programs pop up throughout the state.
And interestingly, I think they were looking at possibly trying to reuse black water as part of this pilot. So it was definitely going to be an interesting one to watch. And the governor's veto message on this was, he said that in his opinion, domestic reuse of wastewater is already authorized by current TCQ rules, and he felt this legislation was not necessary. And of course, there was a big bill that passed last session by Representative Howard that created expanded the use of gray water to allow for indoor toilet flushing, and made other changes and directed TCQ to modify their rules significantly around reuse. So, and there is a guidance document being developed by TCQ around those issues that has not come out yet. We're expecting to see that soon. So perhaps we'll see something that spoke to this pilot program in that guidance. We'll see where all this goes.
Great, thank you, Heather. The next bill that was vetoed, once again, one that we were closely following, sponsored by Chairman Larson, is H-Bill 2943.
So this bill was making a number of changes to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which is one of those federal loan programs that the Water Development Board administers to provide loans for wastewater projects and stormwater management projects and other water quality types of projects. So this longstanding program they've had in place for a long time. It's funded through EPA. And basically this would extended the Clean Water State Revolving Fund loan terms from 20 years to 30 years. And also of significance to WEAT and TACWA, it was
explicitly stating that conservation easements could be funded through this Clean Water State Revolving Fund Loan Program for water quality control. And it also seemed to allow for a broader applicant eligibility pool beyond just political subdivisions, because I know the Water Development Board does have funding available, and they encourage people to apply for these funds. Again, these are loans, but they're very low interest loans. They are subject to U.S. Iron and Steel and other federal requirements, however. So the governor vetoed this bill because he stated that he felt these statutory changes would be mandates, and he thought most of the changes outlined in the bill could already be handled by a Water Development Board administratively without legislation. And finally, he stated in his message that he feels using conservation easements is not the best use of this fund, which is disappointing to see, because I personally thought that was a exciting change in this bill, that they were specifically trying to promote conservation easements. But again, it was vetoed, so we don't expect this one to come back during the special session. Thanks, Heather. And moving along down the extensive vetoed list, we have Senate Bill 570, sponsored by Wally. That's relating to the regulation of the retention, storage, transportation, and disposal of used or scrap tires. On the surface of this bill, it's purely a bill that WEAT and TACWA was interested in for just water quality issues of tires and trash and debris in our streams and rivers. We thought this would be a great remediation bill and kind of help keep some of those tires and trash and debris out of our rivers and streams. Exactly, because this was going to tighten up the rules on transporters of used tires and tire processors and create some new registration programs at TCQ. And again, the governor's rationale for vetoing this bill, he said, was that he felt it criminalized the administrative rules regarding tires, and I guess he felt that was just going too far. And I know there's an overall sentiment at the legislature of not of trying to lighten up on rules in general, and so I guess they felt this was going too far in the other direction. Those tires always get a bad rap. And the next vetoed bill that WEAT and TACWA closely followed is Senate Bill 1525, sponsored by Perry, with a companion bill sponsored by Larson. And so this was a bill that was directing the Water Development Board to do a study, a broad study, and Chairman Perry said that he thought this could be used as a guideline and an overall vision for the state water planning process that, of course, is updated every 5 years or every 7 years, I'm sorry, through our regional planning process. That was the goal behind this, was just simply to have a study done by Water Development Board, specifically looking at some issues such as diversion of water from contiguous states. So we're talking really big picture here. Reuse possibilities from the oil and gas industry, possible locations for large brackish desal facilities, opportunities for public-private partnerships, and there were other specifics in the legislation and some mapping that Water Development Board would have done. And so what Chairman or the Governor noted on his veto note for this bill was he felt that Water Development Board has the current statutory authority to do this study and did not need legislation for them to do this work. Great, thank you, Heather. And that completes the list of vetoed bills that WEAT and TACWA were following. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list of any of the water bills, water supply bills that were filed during the legislative session, but just those that we were closely monitoring. And in the 85th session, we knew from the 84th and from a summertime of various complaints and issues with some biosolids permits that it was going to be a big biosolids session. We saw a number of bills last session that took the shape of local control of biosolids land application and bracketed prohibition. And if one is to count the companion bills this session, The 85th has the dubious honor of boasting 8 bills dealing with anti-land application of biosolids, grit and grease added to biosolids, and domestic septage. And this is a little quote by one of our members when this person realized that we were going to see 8 anti-land application bills filed. And this legislative activity is largely an outcome that's in line with the notion mentioned earlier regarding Texas's population growth that's creating pressure addressed by lawmakers. So as the urban and rural meet, and as those subdivisions move out into what was previously only farmland, issues are created, and the odors of Class B and biosolids and domestic septage, as well as grit and grease trap waste added to biosolids and then land applied, give rise to a number of complaints. So with that said, when the dust settled and our legislators addressed their constituents' concerns, again, we saw 8 bills, which is the highest anti-biosolids bill count that we've seen in recent history in the Texas legislative session. And it's important to note that all of the anti-biosolids bills did not pass. So as we move through these 8, just do note that none of these bills passed. And the first section of anti-bills that we'll touch on are dealt with the land application of biosolids with grit and grease added to the back end of the Class B and then land applied. And this actually came out of an issue surrounding the Victoria area, where one land applier was mixing grease and grit trap waste to Class B biosolids and then land applying, which caused a number of issues, including having their permit pulled, in fact. And they're now in contested case and moving through SOA, and we should have more to report on that issue later. But it did cause the constituents to come together and pull together for a pretty cohesive and vocal NIMBY movement. And Cole Corsten Stevenson picked up the cause and filed a couple of bills, as well as Jeannie Morrison. So the first 2 companion bills, Senate Bill 746 and 2517, would have prohibited the permitting of Class B sludge with the addition of grit and grease trap waste. So essentially, you could not land apply Class B sludge if it had grit and grease trap waste mixed in on the back end, which is, to most folks, when reading the TAC rules, it's not allowed currently. But there's a bit of ambiguity that the contested case hearing is going to resolve, as well as some direct questions posed at the commissioner's agenda meeting several weeks ago that should clear up any ambiguity in this moving forward. And Jeannie Morrison's bill was nearly identical to the Cole Corsten Stevenson bill. It added some additional language that spoke to processed grit and grease trap waste. So WEAT and TACWA were concerned at the onset that processed language would then pull in anaerobic digesters into the mix and inadvertently disallow any land application of any biosolids. But as interpreted by the TCQ, that would not have been the case. We did see that the 2092 bill, sponsored by Morrison, had the longest legs. It, in fact, it did receive a committee hearing and passed out of the committee, but did not pass out of the House floor. And the next bill that we saw is one that actually combined 2 bills sponsored by Ray in the 84th session. And so this was a bracketed bill, heavily bracketed, and appears to only cover Ellis County, although when some overlaid a population map to county lines, it may have incorporated other counties as well. But in essence, it would allow the county commissioners to prohibit land application of all classes of biosolids in the county. And WEAT and TACWA believe that this is demonstrative of the ongoing anti-biosolid sentiment across the state. And as WEAT and TACWA have stated previously, and those in the industry know, bills like HB 1250 are pretty regressive and deny farmers access to valuable soil amendment and reverse the trend of turning a waste into a resource, thereby forcing utilities to landfill a beneficial product. And they also set a dangerous precedent, damaging to biosolids programs across the state. I also want to add just a little bit more background on this. Rep. Ray's district does cover Ellis County, which was the epicenter of a renewed anti-biosolids movement that began several years ago and resulted in a petition for rulemaking. I believe that was in 2013 and 14. And it has also inspired NIMBY movements across the state. And the next bills were anti-land application of domestic septage, and both sponsored by Burns and Birdwell, and their districts cover the Cleburne area as well as surrounding areas. But in Cleburne, we saw issues of over-application of domestic septage on a certain tract of land. And again, as urban meets rural, these issues become really in stark relief. And a new baseball stadium was put in quite close to a land application site for domestic septage. So if you over-apply and it rains, you have runoff going into the baseball field, which really rallied the local folks, and Burns and Birdwell's constituents wanted to see something done. And so the first two bills essentially sought to move domestic septage treatment and permitting to that in line with the regulatory standards seen in Class B. Currently, domestic septage, you actually don't get a permit for it, you get an authorization. So it's a little bit less, it allows for less community involvement and recourse, since you cannot take an administrative piece of land that has been registered to contested case. You can't actually contest that administrative portion of it. And the actual treatment requirements for domestic septage are less rigorous than Class B biosolids. And this, in essence, is due to an understanding that domestic septage waste does not contain industrial waste. Well, we know that can be untrue at times. But the idea is that if it doesn't have heavy metals and it doesn't have those potential issues that are resolved in pretreatment programs, that it doesn't need to be treated to the same level. Well, WEAT and TACWA actually have passed kind of a understanding and resolution within the organizations that seeks to have domestic septage pushed up to the treatment standard of Class B. Moving on to the next two bills, both companion bills and identical, both also sponsored by Burns and Birdwell. This just sought to create kind of a study of soil monitoring samples from land application units where domestic septage and biosolids are applied. This is pretty duplicative to soil sampling, quarterly soil sampling already required by Class B, though it's not required by land application sites for domestic septage. So we thought these two bills could have cleared up some misunderstanding and misinformation regarding Class B land application, as well as provide some important scientific documentation on domestic septage land application.
Julie, I'll just jump in here for a minute. great summaries, and thanks for all of your hard work on these bills, in particular, testimony you did at the Capitol on a number of these. Great leadership there by WEAT and TACWA. But I just wanted to note there will be interim studies, interim charges of committees between now and the next regular legislative session, which will start in January 2019. The Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker will determine what those charges are to those committees. But this is a ripe topic, I would say, for an interim study. And I think these bills are a good testament to that. So hopefully we'll see that charge, which means there'll be formal hearings during the interim when they have more time to think and process. And then they come up with reports that can help drive legislation next session.
Absolutely. Thanks for that addition, Heather. As she said, this would be a good opportunity to clear up misconceptions and to really allow for a better understanding of the benefits of biosolids, as well as kind of clear up misunderstandings surrounding risks and risk analysis. So WEAT and TACWA would like to see domestic septage and land application of biosolids come up as an interim charge, interim study. All right, so moving on from land application bills that didn't pass to general wastewater and stormwater bills that did not pass.
So we're going to move through these pretty quickly in the interest of time. Again, none of these passed. In fact, this House Bill 98, I don't think even had a hearing. It was just going to make some minor adjustments to the current requirements for publishing notices in newspapers, print newspapers, whenever there's a TPDS permit application for a new permit or renewal. I think this is just looking at some language translation requirements, but this bill never had a hearing. And then we had another set of bills by Representative Farrar and Senator Rodriguez that would have directed TCQ to do a study on green stormwater infrastructure. Those bills did get hearings, and but also did not pass.
Great, thank you, Heather. Next up, we have companion bills, HB 2885 and Senate Bill 1507. And as said before, Larson is a creative water thinker, and he's looking at new and innovative ways to move water around the state. And HB 2885 would have allowed for folks to have a discharge permit to treat brackish and then put that treated water in a stream or river to move it to a different river basin. So essentially, it would move it out of a pipeline and put it in a natural water course.
And it would have also provided for some streamlining at TCQ with bed and banks permit authorization process being streamlined. Again, if the source water was treated brackish water, this was a really interesting bill that took some unpacking and again, very creative idea. But as I understand it, you would have still had to have a traditional TPDS permit on the back end, and this would simply kind of reallocate the amount of water that was attributable from the source water that came from treated brackish water, that amount of water could be reallocated from your TPDS return flows to have an expedited bed and banks permit or a possible interbasin transfer. So it was all in the idea of trying to facilitate new water uses and obviously try to incentivize treated brackish water, because again, that's expensive. So they're trying to give some incentives on the permitting side, but this did not pass.
Great, thank you, Heather. And the next three bills you see on your screen are fairly similar to each other. There's just a few language changes, but essentially HB 3036 looked at restricting discharge into the Edwards Aquifer area.
Right, and so these were all, again, very similar, and the one that was the farthest reaching geographically was House Bill 3036 by Representative Tracy King. It also, I think, got furthest in the process legislatively, and it would apply more broadly to the contributing zone of the Edwards Aquifer and could have affected imposed discharge bans in areas that affected a number of river basins, Colorado, Guadalupe, San Antonio, and Oasis River basins, and quite a few counties. I think this was being driven in large part by San Antonio, potentially some San Antonio interests. And then a more narrow bill was only in terms of its geographic scope, was discharge permit restrictions over just certain segments of the Edwards Aquifer related to the Colorado and San Antonio, or the Barton Springs and San Antonio segments. So it would not have covered the northern Edwards. And they both bills had some provisions for stormwater discharges and other, exceptions. Again, none of these bills passed.
Great. And the next two bills, again, we're going to move through these fairly quickly. 4221, sponsored by Elkins. This is commonly known as the Seaman Bill, and would require an asset analysis of current condition of infrastructure. Most cities are already doing this and do have an asset management assessment in place, and that's a major part of a well-functioning treatment plan and collection system. However, with this particular bill, there were questions on, there's a cost question, there was a timing question. The first analysis was due December 1st, or would have been due by December 1st, 2018. And some folks felt that deadline for initial audits is not doable. And others pointed out that there was an issue with definition of parameters of the audit. Were these to be desktop audits where someone checked boxes and just went through utility records, or are these other or true assessment major audits of capacity management and operations of a system, which would have been far more intensive, far more costly, and would have been difficult to achieve by a December 1st, 2018 deadline. Again, this bill did not pass. And Senate Bill 1598 by Miles. We've seen the environmental racism bills come up in previous sessions. This one didn't pass. It didn't get very far at all, but it sought to restrict discharge permits in low-income and minority communities. And we saw a number of contested case bills that didn't pass. The first one on your screen, 1115, would define any elected official as an affected person. So that affected person, any elected official, could then bring a permit up for protest in contested case. This did not pass. Again, it's kind of bucking the trend of most contested case bills we saw, and would put a little bit more power back in those protesting a permit. H Bill 3004, sponsored by Isaac. We saw this in the last session as well, and would basically dismiss any protests on wastewater discharge permits if the city protesting had a less stringent discharge permit than that they were protesting against. And this is one of those bills that comes out of a fairly lengthy and ongoing issue between City of Austin and Dripping Springs. And the last bill on your screen, 1628, sponsored by Estes, was a pretty lengthy bill. And so if anyone wants to digest, I believe it was 42 pages long, digest that and get back to me on a better synopsis. The one we've settled on is essentially that bill would have replaced a contested case hearing for certain environmental permits with a petition for administrative review. So it in essence downgraded contested cases to an administrative review process. And with that, I am going to let Heather kind of give a crystal ball update into the special session and what we might see coming up in the next 30 days.
Okay, so just very quickly, the special session, as the governor dictates when it starts, when it ends, and what the topics will be per the Constitution. And he has decided that we will come back July 18. So this is the full House and Senate that will be back in session. But again, the governor decides what topics they can address, what bills can be passed. But unlike other prior special sessions, there's a very broad list of topics this time. Very high priority is reauthorizing some agencies that were going to expire in the medical communities, predominantly the Texas Medical Board that oversees doctors. But then there are other smaller medical related agencies as well. But he has then said that he wants the, other issues can come up after that sunset legislation is taken care of. And of course, Lieutenant Governor has been pushing for the bathroom legislation to return, which is on the list. There's annexation. There is property tax reform. There is school finance, school choice, some abortion-related issues. And of course, the governor can continue to change these topics going forward. So far, no bills have been filed yet. The governor gets to decide if they can file bills prior to July 18 or not. He has not made that announcement yet, to my knowledge. So we'll see. And so the session can last a day. It can be up to 30 days. I'm sure this will be more than one day. And he can call several as well. And there have been some in the past. There have been upwards of 3 or 4 special sessions. Each one can't last more than 30 days, but he could call another one right after, or he could send them home and call them back later. So to be determined, but there's a lot still in play. Again, those bills we talked about earlier that were vetoed, we don't expect to see those come back. However, bills that got very close to passage and had a lot of hearings, such as annexation legislation that allows people to vote before being annexed, that legislation can come back and pass very quickly, and we expect that some form of that will pass this go round, and it won't have to go through the full hearing process in the House and Senate committees because it has already been so vetted during the regular session. Now, bills that come up that are new, that haven't gone through any kind of hearing process, technically should go through committee hearings, but again, it's all going to happen very fast. So we will stay on it. We will be on it. Julie will be on it as always, and we will keep you posted as best we can going forward. If anything comes up on water, we don't see any specific water issues earmarked in the call right now, but that could change or things could slip in under broader issues. So just stay tuned. And we do have a question from someone.
Yeah, thank you, Heather, for that synopsis of the special session. And we did have a question come in, a few questions, in fact. First one is, how soon would House Bill 2729 for high school students go into effect? And what grades particularly would be preferred? All freshmen through seniors? And what about seniors that have just graduated for summer training? So Heather is going to take the front end of that question about the bill's effective date.
Okay, thanks, Julie. So yeah, I'm looking at the bill right now. It actually looks like it goes into effect by 2017, but it directs the Texas Education Agency and the Texas Higher Education Board. They are given a deadline in the bill by September 1, 2018, along with Texas Workforce Commission, to come up with this inventory. And all this bill does is direct those state agencies to develop an inventory of credentials or certificates, that high school students could earn while in high school. It doesn't specify grade levels. It's very broad. I'd be happy to send the person asking the question the specific bill language, and we can talk more offline. It just simply says that these state agencies need to put this inventory together and update it every year and provide the inventory of certificates to every school district. So this is a great way to get the word out on, again, those water and wastewater certificate processes that are already in place at TCQ. Doesn't change those certificates or requirements. It's just a reporting tool of what's already out there.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And in the interest of time, we are about 2 minutes over time right now. So I just wanted to thank everyone for jumping on and joining us. And again, this is not an exhaustive list of water bills that were passed, vetoed, or followed by WEAT and TACWA in the legislative session, but a list of our highlights. If you'd like to view this webinar in its entirety or look at the presentation slides as a PDF, go to www.weet.org/2017legwebinar.shtml. And I will also send out my legislative tracking list with updates on pass, fail, or vetoed to everyone that attended the webinar. Thank you again, and feel free to shoot myself, Julie Nargong, an email at julie@weet.org, or Heather Cook, an email at heather.cook@austintexas.gov. And I'd like to thank Heather for her all of her work throughout the session in tracking bills and keeping WEAT and TACWA members updated, as well as her colleague with the City of Austin, Kendra Garrett. So great work to both of y'all, and thank everyone on the line for attending and playing a part in this with us. Thank you so much. Thanks, Julie.